It is a good Friday, y'all. It is your boy Paul's Christian Apologetics, and today I'm joined by the one and only Undevelopment team from
Hello.
Rob Sentinel Apologetics. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Gotcha, cool. Um, Let me see if I have the volume set up just fine. Can you talk real quick?
Yeah, sure.
All right, bet. Cool,
And I can turn me up at any time if you need me to.
sweet. But yeah, so today we're going to be going over another one of Undevelopment's interesting biblical theories. And this one is going to be on how Mark is the biological son of Peter. But before that, really quick, Undevelopment, can you tell us a little bit about yourself for anyone who's like tuning in, like that's new?
Yeah, well, I'm a Christian. I'm an artist. I'm a writer. And I have a lot of time on my hands, so I like to study. And I'm also part of the Sentinel community. I'm not an apologist. I'm not a scholar, but I do read information as much as I can, mostly when it's given to me or relayed to me in any significant way. Like if I'm looking for answers to something, I will go to the people who usually have those answers to absorb that information. I have written a commentary on eschatology, and that's available on my blog. And my blog, that is also available, is for just biblical commentary in general. My translation that I'm doing for the books, which is going very slow, is like half of my commentary. So I have a disclaimer and everything that it's not a scholarly work. It's not anything to be taken too seriously. But if it comes to light that maybe something that I've done is just bad or wrong, then people can let me know and I can change it.
Gotcha. And yeah, sounds good. You gave a shout out to your full preterist eschatology, so there's that.
That's not
So
what
yeah,
it
this
is,
is
though.
gotcha. Okay, fair enough. But yeah, this is his blog. He has various commentaries on various biblical books, and like he was saying, he translates some of the original language. Um, so yeah, if you guys are tuning in, you guys already know me. Apollo's Christian Apologetics. That's the name I go by online. An apologetics research channel trying to probe the not so talked about research questions when it comes to Christian apologetics. So without further ado, we'll dive right into the topic. So yeah, let's just remove this and share this. All right, who is John, also called Mark? Take it away.
Well, he's Peter's son. So just hang on. The simplest way that you could just say this is the conclusion, the end of it there. Peter says, this is my, like, he didn't say this is my son. He says, my son Mark sends his greeting. And what sparked that interest into finding out what he meant was sort of the role that Mark possibly secretly plays throughout the Gospels. And it's mostly, you're going to see him show up just like a little bit here and there in Mark and in John. And it wasn't until the point where I was reading about the feeding of the 5,000, which I'll get into, that I noticed that this was going on. So that's what I'm putting forward. Obviously, that's in the title, so I can't really hide that and then come to it later, but that's fine. Where does he come from and what is his role in the early movement? Now, if you go to slide 1 here, I need to establish a case for the language. This is very important because I've had pushback as soon as I made this I presented this as a theory. I had people saying, no, that's not what Peter's saying. So the important things to note: number 1, Jesus and John as children in the Gospels. This is important. They are important characters. They're what the Gospels are introducing us to at the very beginning. It's like, hey, John, he came to make the Lord's highway, and then Jesus came to walk that highway. And so you can't escape that. But it talks about, maybe not, Mark himself, but Luke talks about the childhood of John and Jesus. So he names them. But they're also adults in the time of the telling of the Gospels. So that's a little unusual for what I'm going to put forward later. That these two main characters, it's not about their childhood, it's about their adulthood, and it's mostly about Jesus, important characters, and their childhood just goes real fast. So there's not a whole lot there. Well, Jesus is called by this word here, which means child. And Luke uses this word when Jesus is 12 years old, and he's at the temple at Passover. He stays behind. So 12 years old, called a child. This could be like infancy up to sometimes 15 years old. It's around the time of puberty. There's a second stage, and there's a different name for that. But aside from these two characters, no other children are given names in the Gospels. And if that's not true, let me know, because I could not find any. So go to slide 2, and we'll actually talk about how one of these children is actually talked about. The slide did something weird there, but that's fine. So Jairus' daughter in Mark, and then we'll talk about Jairus' daughter and how she's talked about in Luke. She's given a name in traditions, and that's about as far as that goes. She doesn't actually have a name in the Gospels. I'm talking about how the Gospel authors do not name children. So if Mark is in there somewhere, he's not going to be named. Even if he's the author of Mark, he's not going to be named. Luke's not going to name him. Matthew's not going to name him. John's not going to name him. They just don't do that. So here with Jairus' daughter, she is introduced by Jairus himself, who says, "My little girl is sick." So he says this to Jesus, and he uses this word for little girl. That's important because it's not just daughter, it's little daughter or little girl. And then while this is going on, while Jesus is going to go with him to heal his daughter, there's another scene, the woman with the bleeding. And then after that, someone from Jairus' house comes to Jairus and says, "Your daughter is dead." So he uses that word for daughter. So we haven't gotten a sense yet, besides the little daughter, that this is a child. But we do know she hasn't been named. So Jesus takes the hands of her parents and goes, inside and upstairs, and there's there's the moaners and the weepers, and they're in there. And he says that the child is not dead, she's only sleeping. And he uses this word for child, which is off of the root of the same word that was used for Jesus when he was 12 years old. And then he says, "Talitha cum." So, and they give in the Greek the translation, which means "little girl, arise." That's not giving her name. Her name's not Tabitha, which is what some of the traditions will jump to. There's an actual translation in the Gospels of what this means, not saying that's her name or anything. And then Mark concludes with using the same word that he translated for his audience to say that she was about 12 years old. So he's saying that this word, daughter, little daughter, and the word for child here, it's all connecting to, again, someone who is 12 years old. So they haven't hit puberty yet. That's their point. This word is applied to that. But this is also going to become a pattern. If you go to the next slide, we'll talk about how Luke covers her. So Jairus' daughter, you're going to see most of it's just the same, except that he doesn't call her little daughter. He introduces her in this, as Jairus says, my daughter is sick. And then Luke says that she was about 12 years old. So he's already connected the daughter to tell us that she's little daughter, she's a child. And Jesus takes the hands of the child's parents. And so there's that word there. And Jesus tells her, child, arise. That's how Luke puts that forward. So he just uses the word child there. And here, Luke also connecting the word to a 12-year-old and that they are a child, but they're not named. So that's the first major child that we can talk about that's in the Gospels. None of the authors are going to give her a name. They're not going to say her name, even though she may be an adult by the time the Gospels are being written. They just don't do that. Besides Jesus, who is dead by the time the Gospels are written and has risen by the time the Gospels are written, John, who's been beheaded by the time the Gospels are written, they were already adults. But the children don't give their names. So the next one is a healing in Matthew 12. And this is all linguistic argument, by the way. I'm trying to set this up. It's a long walk, but it goes somewhere. So if you go to slide 4. So this is sort of an anomaly. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with this. I couldn't find any actual defense for this word that's been used for child to describe somebody who's 12 years old. Used to describe somebody who is 12 years old, to call them a child. I explained how Luke connects the daughter and the little daughter, and how Mark connects that to the word child. In the ESV, in Matthew 12, for this healing, the centurion goes to Jesus and says in the ESV that his servant needs healing. But it's a word for child. This servant isn't named. And it's a healing that somebody, an adult, has to go to Jesus for, to say, hey, come heal my person who's at home, using the word for child. I think that's strong enough to say that he's not talking about a servant. And I know the Chosen has made, like, kind of mixed this together, because in that show it's a servant child or the child of the centurion's servant, and they even chose a main character amongst their cast to be the centurion that goes to Jesus. But aside from that, even they're acknowledging that even though Matthew says servant, and that's what they're drawing on here because Matthew's the one who mentions this and the others don't, that this is a child by the word for child. But we never hear about them again. That's it. So they're there. Please heal my child. I know that you can heal them. You know, you don't have to go to my house. You can heal them because I tell. And I think what Matthew's saying there, just to sidetrack just a little bit, the centurion is saying when he tells his child to do something, he does it. So he's saying he's a good dad. And Jesus says, you know, your faith, you know, whatever. But you know, the child will be healed. And when he goes back, he finds out that his child was healed. And then we might get into a little bit of confusion for the next slide, for slide number 5, because here's a character that Matthew alludes to being an adult. But the illusion is, it's like very vague, because the word used is a word that could apply up to, as I say here, 40 years old. But it's the next stage. It's right after child, and then you have this stage of life. This is what people are called. So it could be 15 to 40 years old. I think that they're young. I think that the point of Matthew, who first introduces the person by saying this one, later calls them this word, which is generally translated to young man. But having been used up to 40, that gets kind of confusing. Now, Matthew doesn't have the response of the man be about the law. I have kept these from my youth, but he does mention youth in the other gospel. So in Mark 10 and Luke 18, they call him, Mark calls him a certain person, and then Luke calls him like a ruler, to suggest that they are older. But they also don't use the word, they don't call him a child, and they don't call him a young man. It's only Matthew who does that. So I think maybe, and this is just from me, a little bit of skepticism on Matthew here. I think maybe Matthew, or the author of Matthew, is a little confused by the youth comment. I've kept these from my youth. And then he interprets him to be a young man. But if it's up to 40, they could both be true. And yet, the point of this is that this is a different word. I want you to pay attention to this word too, because this is going to be important. And I can't pronounce it, and I'm sorry for that. I'm not even going to try. But they don't have a name. And I think that's important, because Mark has it, Luke has it, Matthew has it, and no one has named this person, which is unusual unless they are a child or considered to be very young. And in Mark and Luke, you could get the idea that even though they're a ruler or whatever, that, I've kept these from my youth, that they're a little bit older. But Matthew's case, using the word for young man, seems to suggest that this word is used for somebody a little bit younger. And yet the whole thing's kind of a mystery. I think the best I can say about this is just that this word for this term, young man, is a little confusing. And yet we're going to see it again. So in the next slide, there is another young man. Now, this one's a little bit harder. I have heard people say that they think this other young man is Mark. But why Mark is there is a little hard to say, because that's where we start to speculate. I think if you don't connect this to being who I think Mark is, then you just have to make something up if you want to explain why this person is there. But I think it's also interesting that even though the previous young man was called by Mark a certain person, not exactly in those words, in this instance, Mark is actually calling him a certain person. But it's kind of like, as a writer, when I read that, I think, oh, he's alluding to himself. Because you have Jesus arrested, and kind of only two people follow him. And they've already been named. There's no reason to not give their names. And that's Peter and John. But the Gospels don't mention John actually, tagging along or trying to follow. Only Peter is mentioned as actually, at a distance, trying to keep a safe distance and following Jesus at his arrest. And then there's a young man who was also trying to follow, and they go to grab him, and he slips out of his cloak and runs away naked. For me, this would make sense, not just for Mark to not give his own name here, that he was the one, but also that because I think this is indeed Mark, who is Peter's son, that he would be following in this moment. It's the Passover. They're in Jerusalem. If this is his dad, he's in Jerusalem. If his dad's having the Passover, he's having the Passover with his dad. So when he goes out to the garden, there's a commotion at some point, and Mark could be there. And Mark, being the certain person, not naming himself, but at this point could be a young man. Now, and I say at this point could be a young man, which means that he actually has a little bit more freedom to be in some locations without, like his mother around or something, because his father would be going on these different trips and relying on the kindness of strangers and camping and things like that for a while following Jesus. You got 3.5 years of ministry. Well, that's also, a couple years from what happened prior, where if this is indeed Mark, he's not a young man yet. He hasn't hit that next phase. And that's here at the feeding of the 5,000 on the next slide. Because this is where I noticed that maybe this is the subtle hinting between the Gospels that this person that's here is either related to the group or part of the group of disciples. But they don't name them, which I've shown is a common thing for children, at least. So if you've read this recently, the feeding of the 5,000 takes place after Jesus sends out the 12 in twos to the towns of Israel. And he gives them instructions, and some of those instructions are to not take food. And then when they come back, there's a crowd around them because they've been going out, they've been doing these things, and they can't get a moment's peace. They can't even eat. It says that. So Jesus suggests that they go to a desolate place, like a private place where people won't be, and that they're going to get on their boat and they're going to cross the sea to this other place. Now, if you're tracking the geography of this, they would be headed most likely back close to Peter's hometown. Now, this is where his wife and child would be if he indeed has a wife and a child. But there's something interesting here. And I got this from, I keep saying it's interesting. Of course, it's all interesting, but the thing that interests me in this case here is something that I got from, I think it's Euler's Identity Crisis. He has a commentary on the feeding of the 5,000, or he's going over, maybe going over Mark or something, but he mentioned, and I've heard others mention too, that the crowd that is waiting for Jesus, they're like waiting to see where he will go because they get to this place before him. So they're on the other side of the sea, but they send word, they run, and they gather all these people. And then the Gospels mention that it's 5,000 men. And we call this the feeding of the 5,000. Now, you'll hear people say, or right, 5,000 men besides women and children. So there's more than 5,000. But the language doesn't support that. Apparently, it is saying that these are men. That's it. It's 5,000 grown men. They are ready to start a war, basically. They are expecting to make Jesus their king, and they are expecting to be rallied against the Romans. They think this is happening. And then when Jesus tells them to be divided into 50s, groups of 50, those are military units. He's having them all sit down, all of these men, in the formation that they expect to be in. Of course, he turns that on their heads and he teaches them instead of, getting them excited and arming them. And then they get hungry. So Jesus tells his disciples to feed the people. He doesn't tell them to get food from the towns. He doesn't tell them, although they do mention that, like, are we supposed to, buy food for all these people with 200 denarii? And he says, you feed them. And they make that comment. He says, well, how many loaves do you have? So they have to go find out how much food they have. Now, I just mentioned earlier that they came back from their mission, going out to these other towns, told not to take provisions. They're hungry with the crowd around them. They can't even eat. So that's why they've gone out to this desolate place, so they can have some privacy, so they can do something like eat. So they don't have any food with them. They shouldn't, at least. And yet there is food with them. Now, Mark says, when they found out. So how many do you have on you? When they found out, it was 5 loaves and 2 fish. But John gives us a little clue that there's something else going on here. It's not the disciples that have the food. It's a little boy. And Andrew, and this is what it says in John 6. Andrew, brother of Peter, says, there is a little boy here with 5 loaves and 2 fish. So Jesus is saying to his disciples that his disciples must feed the crowd. Now, this is one of my current problems with depictions of this and with the way people teach this, where they suggest that they got the food from the crowd. But he didn't tell them to get food from the crowd. He told them to feed them. It's also, from my perspective, it's kind of ridiculous for Jesus to, have them go out and collect food from these people that are hungry, they shouldn't have food, but, it says that they don't, basically. And then to take that food and then him and his disciples eat it first. But that doesn't seem to be what's going on, because Andrew is the one who mentions that there is a boy there, a little boy, a child, who has these 5 loaves and 2 fish. And that should be what we think is from among the disciples in some way. And I think that's from Mark. I think Mark is the little boy, Peter's son, mentioned by Andrew, that he has brought food. Why wouldn't he? If everything that I'm saying is true, where did this boy come from? Well, the town, not too far. If everybody around is, looking out for Jesus and he's coming back with all of his disciples, Mark would know about it, and he'd want to get food and bring it to his father and his father's brother, his uncle, because it's 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's plenty for one person, but it's a little much, and also a little much for a little boy. Like, why does he have this food? And it's not just asking questions. There is something going on there that they're not naming him. Andrew is named. Peter is named. Those are important, because that's the author's way of actually connecting us to who this child is, I believe. So the big thing that I mentioned at the beginning in slide 8, Peter calls Mark his son. He just does. I looked at this, and this is where I got my pushback, where they said, no. He's saying son like how Paul calls Timothy his son. But he's not. He's using this word that is used to denote that somebody is either biological, they are legitimate in some way, they are the rightful inheritor. That's what this sonship term is. So Peter says, as Silvanus writes, that Silvanus, the author, gives greetings. She who is in Babylon greets the recipients, and my son Mark. And he uses this word, huios. And strangely enough, let me see if I actually mentioned that here. Yeah, I mentioned that later. I won't mention that yet. You have Silvanus writing the letter, not Mark. And the people mentioned, from this letter should be the people closest to Peter. So the author, she who is in Babylon, also not named. But I think we generally understand Babylon in this mention is to mean Rome, because this would be when Peter is in Rome. And I think I'm a little iffy on the timeline of things. I'm still working out where everything happens and at what time period it happened. But this is generally around when people think, if they're going to have an early date for Mark, they're going to say Mark was written around this time. But then my question would be, why isn't Silvanus the author, in your opinion, and not Mark? But going to Paul doesn't use huios. Uses a different word. And this is the word that you would use to be some kind of a child in a, metaphorical sense. So it's much more apparent that Paul is not calling Timothy his biological son. And there are other words that Peter could have used. If you expected him to be calling Mark a disciple, there's, I think, 2 or 3 words, but I didn't get into all of that. But any time that this word is not used for a personal relationship, like a sonship of some kind that is much stronger than just like a spiritual successor or an interpreter or something like that, it's not used as a person to a person. For example, son of God or son of man. You also have a mention of son of the spirits. And then I think in some Greek legends, there was son of a hero. So those are some examples. But as you can see, there's not a, like son of Paul or son of Peter that's ever used like this for anybody except for, of course, Mark to Peter. Now, in Acts 12, is that what I mentioned? Kind of. It's going around. So the next slide's kind of going around Acts 12 there. I like to say, I think Mary is Peter's wife, not that Mary. Because there's a lot of Marys. There's too many Marys. In fact, this Mary in Acts 12 is Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark. That's how she's identified. If it was any other Mary, she would be identified with the way that they have identified her previously. But this is Mary, the mother of John, who is also called Mark. And not only do I think that Mark is Peter's son, which would help this argument, but I think Mary is Peter's wife, not mentioned by Mark, not mentioned in the Gospels, and not mentioned elsewhere. And by Peter himself, doesn't mention her name. He says she who is in Babylon, and I think that's also his wife that he's talking about. At the time of First Peter, if Peter's in Rome, then she's in Rome. At the time of Acts 12, if Peter's living in Jerusalem, she's living in Jerusalem. So she has a house in Jerusalem. Peter's arrested. Stephen is dead. There's a lot of danger for the apostles. And there are Christians, the church is praying for Peter. But one specific house is mentioned because when the Lord frees Peter from prison in Acts, Peter, a married man, goes to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who is also called Mark, where people are praying. What are they praying for? Well, probably Peter, who's in jail. I think that's mentioned earlier in Luke. In Acts, by Luke. And when Peter knocks on the door and asks to be let in, Rhoda, the servant girl, recognizes Peter by his voice. Doesn't even open the door, just gets really excited that she hears his voice, knows him by his voice, and then runs and tells everyone else, and they're in disbelief. I think that's pretty telling. One, she's named. So she's probably, someone that you could go to at the time and confirm that this makes her a witness to this, likely. And that she's probably not a child. And that she's so familiar with Peter that she can just hear his voice. Now, could it be because this is his home, that this is his servant girl, that she does know him like that because this is his family in this house? I think so. And also Mark would be an adult by now. This is where, Luke would be calling him by his name. People would know him a little bit around this time, but maybe they might not be too familiar with him. And it's not to say that Mark is there. It's to say that this Mary is the mother of that guy, Mark, John, who is called Mark. And when I was trying to find out why Papias or Eusebius in this instance, because Eusebius is the one recording the words of Papias, why Papias would take this, he's not unaware of it. He is aware of it. But he takes this and he tries to distance Mark from being Peter's biological son. He doesn't comment on it too much, but he generally says it's understood to be that Mark is Peter's interpreter. And that's what's recorded by Eusebius. And when I looked into why Papias might think this, I found that something said that Philip's daughters are the ones who gave Papias this information. But I think the whole chain at this point seems unreliable. Not for everything Papias says or everything Eusebius says about Papias, but what they're saying about Mark seems unreliable. Not only does the Gospel of Mark have a historical, reliable structure to it, even though it's, laid out in these variously well-crafted ways. And I'm not saying that it's grammatically brilliant or anything. I'm just saying that it's crafted very well. It's put together brilliantly to lead us to question who Jesus is throughout. And that's good. But it's also, as far as the timeline goes, like where they're going and all this stuff, it's cohesive. But Papias seems to think that Mark wasn't like getting this directly from Peter as he was dictating it or something, that he later on decided to write it down, and he did the best he could, though not in order. So he just doesn't seem to understand how well crafted it is. He doesn't seem to understand how accurate it seems to be. And that would be fine. And then I start to wonder, like, okay, well, if he is getting this from Philip's daughters, how aware are they of this relationship of Mark anyway, or when the gospel was written? Because I don't know if you know this. Do you know about the stage play directions that seem to appear throughout the gospels?
No. Do tell more about that.
I don't know too much about it because it's like it's a different era of stage play stuff. It's not something that I would have seen growing up, but I am familiar with the concept that like the Gospel of Mark will be written in such a way where a person could memorize it and perform it while it's being spoken in about 2 hours. And some of the things said are spoken in such a way where it's like it's directing the actor to act the scene out. So if you take the term interpreter from Papias to understand as he's acting out the gospel as Peter speaks it, something that you need to do to have that ready is to write it down and study it. So if Mark is Peter's interpreter, that doesn't mean he's not his son. It means he is the actor who performs the gospel while Peter speaks it. And he had to write it down so that he could study it and be ready every single time. So I don't know. I think Philip's daughters via Papias, via Eusebius is unreliable. Just a little bit.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Is that all when it comes to the presentation?
That's all when it comes to the presentation. There's more. I think I have a little bit more written, but not a whole lot more written down in the blog. And there's a lot of stuff that I stopped myself from writing because it would have taken too long.
Gotcha. So, like, it kind of, the first comment that I have, like, I think, like, broadly characterizes, like, your approach to the New Testament. Like, for example, whenever we did that episode regarding the meaning of most excellent as a title. And one of my concerns is that basically with that kind of approach to the New Testament is that it sort of like neglects like non-literal reference or like literary meanings to various ways that these Greek words are used. So I know that's kind of sort of putting the cart before the horse, but I guess like just like a broader way to characterize like the approach of like trying to look at like semantic ranges and like trying to see where they apply. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about like how you would address someone with that sort of concern?
The first thing, well, because the most excellent is brought up here as an example. If we have other examples, then I could take it case by case, which is my approach. I, for a very long time, because I didn't do this kind of study, believed that the most excellent Theophilus was a symbolic title. That it was just a way of, not necessarily flattering, but kind of flattering the reader in a way to, lift them up and say that, they can be certain of these things. You're doing well, and you are a lover of God. But at the same time, case by case, is that defensible within the context of what Luke is writing in his introduction? And I don't think it is, because the rest of it is suggesting something more personal, that Luke knows this specific person that he's sending this to. And then I think it was 2 days after we did that, because Roken here has a question about it. Scholarly support.
Yeah, for sure. We can go into that if you want
Yeah.
to.
So about 2 days after we did our live stream on Theophilus, I saw somebody who actually has some scholarship practice and things like that, and they go to experts, and they were asking these experts about the ossuary and things like that. They suggest that the Joanna at the cross in Luke is the same granddaughter of Theophilus. I don't really think that that's, I need to see something about how old Joanna is in order to believe that. I don't think that that's actually the case, but that's where they're going with that. And they strongly support the idea, a lot of the same ideas that I was talking about, that Luke is writing to a specific person. Not that it's commissioned, but they're suggesting, again, following the trail that Joanna is his granddaughter, that because Joanna was at the cross, that she's the one who taught Theophilus these things. And not only that, but 37 to 41 AD, there was peace for the Christians from the religious authorities while Theophilus was high priest. So perhaps he did indeed receive the gospel according to Luke, and he took it to heart. That's what they are suggesting. That's what the experts are suggesting.
Gotcha. And did you happen to have that expert's name off the top of your head, or?
No, it's in the video, and I sent that. I believe I sent that in the Discord.
Okay, yeah, no worries. Yeah, we'll provide a link to Sentinel Apologetics Discord later on in this talk, but excuse me.
Yeah. So in the case of, is Mark Peter's son, I have seen that other people have suggested this throughout history, other scholars and things like that. But it's generally a scary thing to say, and I don't know why. I've heard the argument that, even if Papias believed that Peter was saying that Mark was his son, because Papias believed that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark, he didn't want to say that Mark was Peter's actual son, because the pushback would be, oh, Mark's just writing about his father's hero.
Yeah, I think most of the pushback comes from the concern that, one of the requirements for papacy is celibacy. And so, within the Roman Catholic tradition, Peter would be the
Gospels mention his mother-in-law. We know he was married.
And they try to interpret that some of the more ecclesialists will try to interpret that non-literally, the same way they'll interpret, like, say, for example, like the brothers and sisters of Jesus is like non-literal, because they want to, like, preserve the perpetual virginity of Mary and things like that. As for where I stand on that issue, I'll just keep my mouth shut because I want to keep my denomination secret. So, yeah,
they're his brothers. Mary's other children. What are you going to do? One of them's basically named Joseph after their father. So,
gotcha. So, we covered that. One of my next questions kind of deals with, like, sort of like this is more of like a smaller detail, but it deals with, like, the semantic range of, like, huios, which seems to be like one of the main motivators of the argument, how it doesn't apply to like sort of like personal relationships to people. And so I was just looking through, the Strong's like references, and I don't recommend people use Strong's for definition work, just more of like the cross references of where the words appear.
Yeah, well,
if
the
you're
lexicon's a little outdated, but I usually use it for the cross reference. I think that's a lot more helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And I came across 2 Corinthians 6:18. So 2 Corinthians 6:18 talks about God having huios, sons and daughters. Hold up, let me pull up the exact verse. And I will be to you for a father, and you will be to me for sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. So what that roughly translates to in the context of 2 Corinthians 6, let me pull it up, is just basically that, share this tab instead, that God has non-literal sons and daughters while using the word huios. And that seems to be consistent under the view that huios can refer to like non-literal sons and daughters.
Well, yes,
obviously depending on the context. And
when the context itself is to say, hey, this is non-literal, I will be to you a father. Well, the father's a non-literal too.
yeah, for sure.
So yeah, so the following, but at the same time, it's not the word for father is not a word that means non-literal father. So the word for son there is not a word that means non-literal son.
Yeah, well, I guess like the way that like the argument was constructed, at least like kind of like at least the way that it was presented in the slides over here, like kind of like seemed like it was relying a lot on like the semantic range. Yeah, over here like point D of slide 8, when huios is not used for personal relation. And basically you say that like it doesn't correspond to like a non-literal son of like an actual person, as far as like I understand that.
Yeah, so it's not like if it was saying you will be a son to Peter, like if you're going to use huios there, then you got a problem. But it's not saying that. It's not saying you will be a son to a specific person. But even in that, like I mentioned on A there, it's not just biological. It's about legitimacy. It's about inheritance. They are the rightful heir in a sense. And in this case, well, I mean, if you're taking the Catholic view, as you mentioned, that still fits as him being, the rightful heir of Peter. But does that mean that Mark's the second pope?
True that. Hence the original thumbnail for this video. But yeah, like even in this passage in 2 Corinthians, it talks about like Paul having non-literal children. Now, of course, like in this instance, it uses teknon as its noun, but within the broader context, I guess I would say that there's a sense in which these huios like refers like non-literally to like inheritance or like sonship and things like that.
Yeah, well, you're still dealing with qualifiers. I speak as to my children.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
like you're saying
no,
as to my would be like the
yeah, that's a
qualifiers.
qualifier. He's not saying I speak to you, my children.
I mean like so let's just say for instance that he says this in like some in 2 Corinthians, and then we just have to happen to have like an extant 3 Corinthians, and then he refers to them as like a huios.
That would be great.
Yeah.
That would tear it down. That would be great.
Okay.
It also make it a lot easier for me because then I wouldn't have to go through this.
Yeah, for sure. But I guess like what I'm trying to say is that like the view that huios like not only doesn't not need to have like a non-literal meaning, but like the context doesn't have to be immediate. That would be consistent with like the evidence that's portrayed in the New Testament, versus like, oh yeah, it needs to have an immediate context that sort of like justifies its non-literal usage. So, and especially you were talking about how you saw like in other passages, like in your slides, like how teknon, like in First Timothy, refers to Timothy as like Paul's beloved child, and obviously we know Paul was single. And then something similar happens in like Titus as well. But I just happened to know that just because I was browsing through some of this
Yeah,
information.
so in Timothy and also in First Corinthians, talking about Timothy, he uses that word for Timothy, which when you have multiple words that could be used for something, you have multiple words for spiritual son or a successor in some instance, but I just don't see that particular word being used in any other context. I don't see huios being used in the context that people are saying it's being used by Peter. You'd have to just say that, well, this one instance here where Peter's using it is defending itself, but it's not.
Yeah, and I guess like part of like my concern would be like it's kind of like atomistically treating like every word in the New Testament to where like you need like I guess like you could say like under your view it wouldn't have to be like some sort of like justification or like appeal to rationality to say that it needs like a reason for like every single instance, but um
No, you can encounter a word in a library of writings that is only ever used one time in its second definition, but within that you can still see why it's being used in its second definition, but you need the context, you need the syntax, you need to understand what is being communicated. And here, like I said, it would be helpful if we had something where this word is used more clearly for somebody who is not, the direct lineage. But we don't have anything exactly like that. There is no way of defending that. And then within the context of First Peter, just by itself, you don't have a whole lot. But if you actually see what I was setting forward to begin with, if Mark is indeed hinting or being hinted at around the Gospels, then he's been there. People are not naming children in the Gospels. They're not going to name Mark in the Gospels, but he could be these people. He could be this little boy mentioned by Andrew, his uncle mentioning him. He could be mentioning himself, like even if it was, as I put forward the play, if Peter's preaching it and Mark's acting it out, and in Peter's preaching, he said, and then, they grabbed at my son Mark and he slipped away. Do you think Mark's going to write himself into there? I, as a writer, would be uncomfortable with that. But I might include, hey, and then a certain person, mentioning myself. That makes sense to me. And a lot of that comes down to what I was mentioning before. Like I look at this from the perspective of a writer. What kind of things am I used to seeing? What kind of things was I taught for storytelling? And even if and storytelling isn't fiction telling, it's telling the story of something, right? So what kind of things do I look for when looking at the story? And I read these things over and over so that I can understand what's going on, and because I'm dyslexic. And I notice these things that aren't part of the conversation. And that bothers me because here's this little boy in the feeding of the 5,000. It's like, who is this boy? And they're like, oh, that's just somebody in the crowd. And then I look into that and I'm like, well, why would there be a little boy in the crowd? This is 5,000 men ready for battle. But from from a storyteller, this little boy is probably related to the disciples.
Yeah. And on that note, like, are you inclined to say that the Gospels are more like a not fiction, but like fit more into the genre of like Greco-Roman biography as opposed to like historical reportage as advanced by like the McGrew, for instance?
That's a little beyond my
Okay, yeah,
studies.
that's fair. Um,
I for those kinds of things, I just have to defer to someone else.
Gotcha. Fair enough. So what do you have to say to someone who says that, like the prior probability of just like describing like these relationships between believers can include things like filial like words like whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother as instituted by Jesus, and that kind of explains like the greeting within the various New Testament epistles is like greetings my brothers in Corinth, or greetings my brothers and sisters in Christ and things like that. um Now of course like it's not exactly son like my son in Christ, but um regardless, like it would lend credence to the idea that there's a greater probability that these filial words are being interpreted like non-literally, like these familial words are being interpreted non-literally within the broader community of the early church.
I thought you didn't
And
want to talk
so
about Jesus's brothers,
oh
because if you want to get into, people
yeah, well,
saying that Jesus's brothers are there, and then him afterwards saying, mother and brothers, but he's mentioning non-familiar, or non-family brothers. Then what are they mentioning?
yeah,
But
for sure.
he's uh, Jesus is presented as putting forth, and you'll see this in John earlier at the wedding. Woman, what do your concerns have to do with my concerns? He puts forth this idea that it's not about loyalty to your family, it's about loyalty to God. And those who are loyal to God are a family. So if your mother turns against God, then that shouldn't be concerning you because she's your mother. That should be concerning you because she's another human being. So when all these people around him that he's teaching and they're listening to him and they want to follow him are there, and they're saying, hey, people related to you are here. He's like, that means nothing if they're not here, listening to me and following me. You are listening to me and following me. So in that, he's giving them the sense that his real family, in comparison to his, related family, is these people, and they're more important.
Oh yeah, I mean I agree that it like has that broader like literary function.
Yeah. So
I guess
I don't see a reason to draw, like, again, yeah, it's not mentioning son, but in the use of brother here, that's called emphasis in storytelling. He's being not necessarily like hyperbolic or something like that, but he's being very, on the point of what he wants to get across to them as what's important to him. Like they see brother and mother as being priority, and he's saying, well, this is priority.
yeah. I mean, I guess you can argue that if you have non-literal mothers, then you have non-literal sons. So there's that. Um, but yeah, we have a question from Rokin's basically saying, is there anything there for Peter's mother-in-law that could be used for what you're arguing for? I'm not sure if you covered that or not.
uh well, because covering it, she's mentioned, that's, I mean, it's mentioned that he has a mother-in-law. So if you have a mother-in-law, you have a wife. But she was sick, she was healed, and immediately started serving them. You have, I guess, in one account, the disciples urging Jesus like mentioning that she's sick, and then in another account you have Jesus just seeing her and healing her, so you don't have the the direction to heal her. But that's about it. You don't get much else.
So modern atheism says, how could neither Paul nor the church fathers mention something so important? Then he says, let me guess, oh, that's just an argument from silence.
Well, what's important
So
about it?
yeah, so even though like
Well, hold on.
yeah.
So, I mean, I'm here presenting it not as, oh, hey, this is mind blowing, this is earth shattering, this is going to turn everything on its head. It's not. This is just fun. Like,
Yeah.
if it's true, great. If it's not, great. Like, it doesn't change anything. And the fact that it doesn't change anything for us, besides maybe the conversation, because then we can just talk about it a little bit differently. It didn't change anything for them either. Mark was his own person. He wasn't ever called Mark, son of anybody. He was John, who is also called Mark. They knew him as Mark. They knew him as also one of the people of the circumcision party, which didn't make him very favorable. But then even Paul has to defend him. He's also cousin of Barnabas. But as somebody who is traveling to the Greco-Roman world, you are your own person. Paul doesn't go by Saul anymore. He's using Paul because that's the name that they would be using for him. And he's not Paul, son of anybody, because none of that means anything to him. In fact, as I just mentioned with Jesus and the whole family relationship, like, who are my mother and my brothers? It's more important who Mark is in the community than who Mark is the son of. None of that was important in the New Testament period. That was important to the Jewish people at the time. They wanted to know who you were related to.
Yeah, and I guess like even though like I'm not exactly like totally sold on like the thesis, like in terms of like the critique, I agree with Undevelopment that it at least doesn't seem to be a very important like apologetical point that, oh yeah, like now Peter has like a son, now that's his true successor or anything like that. But yeah, I mean like that might be giving a little bit too much away in terms of like what kind of denomination I belong to, but I'll just leave it at that. Okay.
Yeah, and we covered some of that earlier. Modern atheism, I was talking about that before. So some of the transmission just seems a little bit unreliable because it's not directly from Papias to us. It's through Eusebius, and Papias isn't directly from the information either. He's through, as far as I'm aware, Philip's daughters.
Gotcha. All right. I think that
And also the interpreter thing. Sorry. I also
yeah.
explained earlier what the interpreter thing could still be meaning, because it's not saying that he's his author. It's not saying that he's like translating for him or anything like that. There are other words for those things. And First Peter is written by Silvanus. If you're going to say that Mark is the one putting, pen to paper, as the expression goes, for Peter, then that should be Silvanus, not Mark.
Gotcha. All right. I think we can close it out with that. Any final words when it comes to, like pointing out like these interesting connections in the New Testament and like your I guess like why should like I know you kind of talked a little bit about it earlier about how like these are just like fun theories that I have about the Bible, but they don't serve any like huge apologetical point. I guess like my question is like as far as like for the audience to dive deeper into these theories, I guess like why should they care?
Because this is small stuff. I think that is why they should care. This is small stuff. There's a lot of arguments out there about small stuff. Small stuff bigger than this, but it still exists. And a lot of it just comes down to not understanding language, not understanding what the authors are trying to communicate by the way that they communicate it. And so, like even if we were to talk about, well, like, when are you saved? You know, can you lose your salvation? That some of that can be small arguments, because they're picking a verse here and picking a verse there and saying, well, this says this, and then the other person will come in with the counter. But they can't even get that right. And we know they can't get it right because they're arguing about it. Both people think they're right. Both people aren't right. So if you can't like recognize these things, then, and these small things, and you can't get these small things correctly, how are you getting the big things correct? How are you supposed to be trusted to understand what you're reading? Like, what kind of presentations are you making when you see a bad argument, as I have many, many times? You see a bad argument and you say, well, that just must be the case. I don't have anything else. And you use that bad argument, as I have many, many times. Like, it's a little embarrassing, and I think we should be better about it.
Well said, well said. All right, folks, you heard it from Undevelopment himself. That was his second theory on various mysteries in the New Testament. And yeah, we'll see y'all in the next one. I know today is Good Friday, and so not a lot of people are alive, but hopefully some people will make it out to the recording. So until next time. You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider becoming a Patreon member for Apollos Christian Apologetics. Your partnership helps with creating original Christian apologetics research, gets you exclusive access to videos, and more. Want to catch me personally online? Well, feel free to join our Discord server. But in any case, Christianity is true, apologetics is base. This is your boy Apollo signing out. Peace.